The air in the Barnacles Grip hummed thick and sour, a broth made from stale beer, unwashed bodies, and the distant, clinging odor of salt marsh decaying under the summer heat. New Seagate, that grand, gilded pox on the coast, pulsed with the low hum of commerce, a city built on the promise of things moved illicitly from where they weren't wanted to where they'd fetch a price. Down here, at the Scrimshaw Quays, the pretense was thinner than a worn sail. Silas, the undertow, Thorne, a man built like a waterlogged barrel and smelling faintly of fine brandy and bad decisions, slid into the booth. He didn't waste time on niceties. The heavy pouch of silver, landing with a satisfying thud, was enough of an introduction for anyone whose debts were currently whispering louder than their common sense. The character receiving this dubious invitation, let us call them the unwilling protagonist for now, though perhaps they were an ex-investigator named Cale, or a disgraced scholar whose alchemical knowledge was now currency, felt the familiar tightening in the gut that preceded any venture involving Thorne. It was the thrill of necessary danger, the kind of risk that kept the world turning when honest coin dried up. Thorne's eyes, the color of pale, sea-worn stones, were fixed with an unsettling stillness. The job, Thorne had rasped, his voice carefully managed beneath the tavern's din, is for the elixir of fading memory. Magister Velus's final batch. The name of Velus, the brilliant, disgraced alchemist, was a cold draught in the humid air. Velus had vanished 5 years prior, taking his secrets and the Baroness's shattered composure with him. Rumor suggested the Mylans, but Thorne was smarter, or perhaps just better informed about Velus's stubborn habits. The Customs House archive, Thorne revealed, his breath smelling faintly of mint and brine, pointing toward the central, heavily fortified district of the port city. The sealed tunnels beneath, the old flood defenses, from 88. This wasn't a simple smash and grab, this was delving into the rotting foundations of New Seagate itself. The archive was the heart of the Duke's records, a place swarming with the Bureau of Records, men whose loyalty to paperwork was only matched by their proficiency with pikes. The summer sunlight, usually a brazen, unrelenting thing over the high docks, barely penetrated the grimy windows of the Barnacles Grip. Here, the damp chill of the seawall fought a losing battle against the season's oppressive warmth. The protagonist pocketed the silver. It was enough for a week's real food, enough to buy time, enough to forget, momentarily, the state of their own affairs. Thorne gave the rendezvous time, third bell after sundown, the abandoned crane near the Whispering Boys, and then he was gone, melting back into the shadows as quickly as he'd appeared. The immediate consequence was a sudden, sharp awareness of the room. Every eye seemed a little too interested, every shadow a little too deep. The season of planting and growth felt distant. This was the season of risk, where the weeds of desperation choked out the harvest of caution. They had a week, and the smell of ancient parchment and potential doom already clung to them. The next morning dawned with a familiar, heavy clarity. The summer sun of the Kharzalan coast rose quickly, promising a day of searing heat that would drive the port city dwellers toward shaded taverns and slow work. The protagonist, having spent a restless night wrestling with the potential consequences, imprisonment by the Bureau, a nasty encounter with Captain Varus's watch, or worse, whatever Velus had left guarding his final stash, felt the weight of the impending task settle. They spent the first morning gathering essentials. This wasn't the time for a formal supplies run, this needed to be quiet and efficient. A quick, tense visit to a reputable, though slightly crooked, outfitter near the mid-docks yielded a coil of sturdy, oil-treated rope, some hardened leather braces, and a few good grappling spikes, the tools of quiet entry, not open warfare. Their first tactical stop involved sizing up the opposition. The Customs House archive was a granite behemoth, an imposing structure of arrogant permanence. The exterior was patrolled by the Duke's own guards, men with too much pride and well-maintained breastplates. The protagonist moved through the morning markets, bustling with vendors selling early figs and crates of freshly picked cherries, while tinker caravans displayed their wares, using the crowd as camouflage. They noted the watcher's presence, a sharper, colder element than the Duke's men. Captain Varus's operatives moved with efficiency, their eyes sweeping the crowd for any sign of Thorne's usual associates. The heat was already oppressive by midday, shimmering above the cobblestones and making the air thick to breathe. The protagonist imagined Varus, cold and relentless, hunting Thorne, and realized the danger wasn't just finding the stash, but getting out without drawing the watcher's lethal attention. Day 2 was dedicated to reconnaissance of the archive basement's periphery. This meant slipping past the official dockyards and into the less guarded utility access points where the city's ancient plumbing and ventilation systems converged. The scent here changed from sea salt and spices to stale water and the metallic tang of corroded iron. After bribing a nervous, chain-smoking laborer with 2 of Thorne's silver pieces, the protagonist gained temporary access to a seldom-used maintenance shaft leading vaguely towards the seawall foundations. The shaft descended into true darkness, the summer warmth instantly replaced by a clammy, subterranean chill. The sound of the city above became muffled, replaced by the unsettling, distant groan of the massive ventilation shafts, a sound like a dying giant breathing deep below the earth. Days 3 through 5 were spent mapping potential ingress and egress points from the subterranean network, focusing on the 88 flood lines Thorne mentioned. The work was slow, demanding careful navigation through muck and tight spaces, testing the integrity of ancient mortar. During a meager evening meal of hard bread and watered wine on the fourth night, huddled in a forgotten storage cellar near the wharf, the protagonist contemplated the elixir itself. Why such desperation? If Thorne was trying to forget something that bad, the consequences of failure were immense. It suggested a powerful enemy, perhaps even rivals from Valon's Deep, waiting to exploit the silence Thorne sought to purchase. The journey was less about traveling distance and more about crawling inward, through the city's buried secrets, toward a confrontation with either alchemical defense or the cold blade of the Watch. By the eve of the sixth day, the protagonist was ready to breach the sealed tunnels beneath the Customs House archive. The sun had begun its slow, inevitable descent, painting the sky over the cerulean reach in bruised purples and fading oranges, a perfect backdrop for illicit activity. They moved under the cover of the encroaching dusk, the city noise providing a natural blanket of sound. Access was gained through a cleverly bypassed drainage culvert that connected directly to the old, flood-damaged sub-basement area. As the heavy, rusted grate was secured behind them, the oppressive silence of the deep tunnel swallowed all extraneous noise. The air below was thick with the smell Thorne had described, not just damp stone, but the sharp, acidic perfume of decaying parchment, ink turning to dust, and the cold, mineral scent of deep earth. The protagonist lit a dim, hooded lantern, its weak beam barely pushing back the crushing dark. The silence was indeed oppressive, broken only by the soft squelch of their boots in standing water and the rhythmic, structural groan of the ventilation system far overhead, a sound that suggested the immense weight of the administrative heart of New Seagate pressing down upon them. They moved with the practiced economy of someone who didn't want to be seen, relying on the thief's skill to sense loose flagstones and the ranger instinct to follow the path of least resistance, which, surprisingly, was often the path of greatest structural weakness. Navigating the labyrinth was a slow, grinding affair over several hours. The tunnels twisted, clearly designed hastily to manage the sudden influx of seawater during the Great Flood. They passed rusted iron doors, once leading to small storage vaults, now buckled inward. It was here, perhaps midway through the archive's subterranean footprint, that the first sign of Velus's defenses appeared. A pressure plate, almost invisible beneath a thin layer of silt, triggered a faint, almost inaudible hiss. Years of dust and moisture had failed to completely neutralize the mechanism. The protagonist, thanks to the quiet competence honed by necessity, halted instantly, recognizing the fine, almost sweet scent of concentrated poison gas. They used a shard of salvaged slate to trip the mechanism safely from a distance. The resultant puff of air was faint but undeniably chemical. Velus hadn't just left, he'd left a deterrent worthy of his expertise. They pressed on, the need for haste tempered by the absolute requirement for meticulous caution. The heat of the summer day was replaced by a deep, bone-chilling cold that seemed to emanate from the very granite. The protagonist paused at a collapsed archway, momentarily consulting a crude map sketched on treated hide, a map pieced together from Thorne's vague directions and their own observations. They recognized the architecture, they were nearing the hypothesized location of Velus's secure room. Suddenly, a sound sharper than the groan of the vents echoed down the corridor, the distinct, metallic clink asterisk of boot tips on stone, coming from the opposite direction. It wasn't the slow, heavy tread of the Duke's Archives guards, this was tighter, more professional. Captain Varus's watch, alerted by some subtle anomaly, perhaps the minor disturbance of the drainage culvert, or maybe Thorne's movements were being tracked even now, was sweeping the lower levels. The protagonist flattened against the damp wall, the need for speed now violently conflicting with the need for absolute silence. They were now caught between the forgotten traps of a desperate alchemist and the zealous, organized pursuit of the city's most feared law enforcement officer. The encounter with the watch was unavoidable. As the protagonist rounded a bend, seeking a smaller passage marked by a strange, faded etching, perhaps Velus's personal sigil, they collided, quite literally, with a patrol of 3 officers from Captain Varus's specialized internal security detail. The lead officer, broad-shouldered and bearing the severe expression common to Varus's elite, barked an immediate challenge, his hand already on the pommel of his sidearm. The protagonist, remembering the high stakes and the fate that awaited failure, a blank mind, or worse, the swift blade of the watch, reacted before thought could intervene. This was Dalton Fellwinter's territory, though the protagonist likely lacked his legendary mastery, they had learned survival. The fight was brutal and confined. The narrow, slick corridor offered no room for maneuver. The first officer lunged with a short, heavy cudgel intended to incapacitate rather than kill immediately. Varus valued captured information highly. The protagonist sidestepped, utilizing the damp floor to their advantage, letting the officer's momentum carry him momentarily off balance. The apprentice herbalist training, or the investigator's ingrained awareness of anatomy, provided the necessary edge. Instead of drawing steel, a quick, low sweep knocked the officer's legs out from under him, sending him sprawling into the shallow, foul water. The second officer reacted with practiced speed, drawing a reinforced baton. This required more direct engagement. The protagonist ducked low, using the heavy rope, intended for climbing, to quickly snare the baton arm mid-swing, yanking sharply. The unexpected resistance caused the officer to stumble toward the wall, where the protagonist drove an elbow, a surprisingly effective move honed from years of brawling over debts, into the man's temple. A sickening crunch, and the officer slumped, momentarily out of the fight. The third officer was smarter, backing up slowly, drawing a slim, poisoned stiletto, clearly intending to take a prisoner alive or dead through stealth. This silence was dangerous. The protagonist knew the noise had already drawn attention deeper into the archive. With a grunt, they threw the remaining length of rope, not to trip, but to snag the officer's weapon hand high up. As the man struggled for control, the protagonist closed the distance with a speed born of adrenaline and desperation. They didn't fight cleanly, they fought to survive. A desperate shove sent the officer careening backward toward the section of tunnel where Velus's poison trap had been tripped hours earlier. A faint hiss asterisk confirmed the officer had disturbed the secondary release mechanism, perhaps a tripwire masked by a cleverly placed bit of rubble. The officer choked, his eyes widening in sudden, agonizing realization as the sweet, invisible fumes enveloped him. The patrol was neutralized, but the skirmish had taken its toll. The protagonist was bruised, breathing hard, and the sound of more boots echoing from the main corridor confirmed reinforcements were incoming. Driven by the immediate threat, they located the hidden door, a section of wall that felt subtly hollow. Using a precisely applied blow with the butt of a heavy tool, the protagonist cracked the seal, slipping through just as the watch search party rounded the corner, their lanterns casting harsh, accusatory beams into the empty corridor. They had bought themselves a few precious minutes inside Velus's final sanctuary. The air inside was sterile, cold, and thick with the smell of ozone and rare minerals. The destination was reached, but the true danger had just begun, marked by the faint, shimmering barrier protecting the central display case. Inside Velus's hidden room, the oppressive atmosphere of the tunnels gave way to an unsettling, almost pristine stillness. It was a small, circular chamber, lined with shelving units displaying vials of shimmering, unnervingly bright liquids. The summer's heat was entirely absent here, the room felt preserved in eternal winter. In the center, upon a pedestal of obsidian, sat a single, stoppered crystal vial, pulsing faintly with internal, silver light, the elixir of fading memory. The protagonist felt a heavy sense of trespass. This was the final, desperate repository of a man who feared the world and its memories. Reaching for the vial, they noted the protective ward, a shimmering, near-invisible field that pulsed with residual alchemical energy. It wasn't overtly aggressive, more a containment measure. Applying the knowledge gained from observing lesser alchemists during their own disgraced studies, the protagonist remembered the principle of sympathetic cancellation. They quickly located a nearby, unlabeled vial containing a murky, reddish-brown liquid, likely a highly unstable catalyst Velus had used in his earlier experiments. With a steady hand, a nod to their apprentice herbalist training, they poured a single drop of the unstable catalyst onto the edge of the ward barrier. The effect was immediate and spectacular, a brief, silent flare of emerald light, and the barrier dissolved into harmless motes of energy. The protagonist seized the elixir, the vial cold and smooth against their palm, the silver light inside seeming to mock the darkness they'd traversed. Their victory was short-lived. The energy surge from the cancellation had not gone unnoticed. From a dark alcove previously obscured by shadow, a low, mechanical grinding began. Velus hadn't left just potions, he'd left a guardian. A construct, perhaps brass and clockwork, something Wilfred Loamfoot might appreciate for its mechanics but fear for its function, lurched into the light. It wasn't fast, but its movements were inexorable, powered by some complex, decaying mechanism. It carried no weapons, but its heavy, articulated fists were designed for crushing. The protagonist had no desire to dismantle clockwork mastery under the threat of the watch closing in. Escape was paramount. Using a smoke pellet, a simple, reliable tool procured from the shady outfitter, they engulfed the small chamber in a cloud of thick, acrid smoke, smelling vaguely of burnt sugar and sulfur, a final, messy layer over the port city's accumulated grime. They backed out of the chamber, slamming the cracked stone door shut, hearing the dull, rhythmic thump asterisk of the construct hitting the barrier from within. The retreat through the tunnels was a desperate, clumsy affair, fueled by pure terror of capture. They moved like shadows fleeing the dawn, the elixir clutched tight. Emerging near the Whispering Boys just as the moon began its descent, they saw the target rendezvous point, an abandoned iron crane, silhouetted against the faint light reflecting off the restless water. The air tasted fresh, clean, a stark contrast to the stale rot below. The third bell was ringing faintly across the harbor. Silas Thorne was already there, pacing like a caged shark. The final exchange was swift, silent, and devoid of sentiment. The remaining payment changed hands. The elixir vanished into Thorn's heavy coat. As Thorn melted back toward the shadows of the deeper docks, the protagonist was left alone, smelling of damp earth and cheap smoke, a substantial sum of silver heavier in their purse, and a week's worth of hard-won survival behind them. The lucrative job was done, but the memory of the cold, silent tunnels, and the desperate look in the eyes of the watch officer would linger longer than any poison.